today's AODA hands-on training session. We are very lucky to have Linda here with us, and I will introduce her in just a moment. I'd like to start today's event off with our land acknowledgement. And forgive me, I have two screens, so I'm just going to be looking at my other screen. I would like to acknowledge the land of our Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people. I am currently in Newmarket today, located on the land as we know as the Lake Simcoe watershed, which is the traditional territory of many nations of Indigenous people. I recognize this land as part of the Williams Treaties, including the Chippewas of Georgina Island, Rama, Beausoleil, the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, the Credit, and Scugog Island, as well as the Huron-Wendat and the Métis Nation of Ontario Region 7. I'm grateful to these nations for the opportunity to work and play here and share the land. I recognize and appreciate that each of you will have your own land acknowledgement depending on where you are. So I'm going to leave a lot of the housekeeping up to Linda today. Today's session is going to be a hands-on training, and then Linda has also created a guide. It will be a PDF guide that everyone will receive after the training. It's just in its final stages of being completed, and then I'll share that as soon as Linda finalizes that. I would like to mention that I'm grateful to the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks because they have actually provided some funding for today's training and for the guidance to be completed by Linda. I think that's a really good positive step by them, and I do just want to acknowledge that today. So before we go any further, you do see that I am recording the session. That will be available along with the guidance document so that you have that as a resource. I really am excited to introduce Linda Staples. And some of you are familiar and know Linda as she's done some work with Lake Simcoe. She's done some work with Conservation Halton. And I'm so pleased. I'm going to read her bio. It's wonderful. So Linda has an extensive knowledge in accessibility and the AODA legislation. In 2005, Linda participated on several of the accessibility standards committees, which were a fundamental component of the writing of the Accessibility of Ontarians with Disability Act. That's the AODA legislation. As a seasoned professional in project management, she worked at York University as the manager of architectural drafting department. While at York, Linda chaired the Access York Barrier-Free Committee, which worked with the faculty and staff to provide guidance in making York an inclusive environment for all. Most recently, from 2012 to 2015, Linda worked for the Government of Ontario Accessibility Directorate's Office as a project manager in municipal accessibility. In 2016, Linda was contracted back to the Directorate's office to lead a project of accessibility forums across the province. Linda continues to be actively involved in accessibility by recently providing contract services to several conservation authorities, assisting with accessibility documentation. Linda has been an advocate for accessibility for over 20 years as an employee and as a volunteer on several nonprofit organizations' boards. In Linda's free time, she is an avid kayaker and ballroom dancer. Linda's very comfortable with providing training sessions, so I'm going to let her give you some housekeeping rules, and I'll be supporting Linda by watching for questions when she indicates the perfect time to ask them. So Linda, I turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks for actually having me. It's refreshing to be able to have an opportunity to share some accessibility knowledge to what I'm seeing is the upper management forte. And so it's great to be able to do that. I know that from working with some of the other CAs in the province that you are going to be having a lot of PDF and document updating to meet the AODA compliance. So hopefully we'll be able to get you a little more comfortable with that process today. I am going to do the session in two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk about the basics and the fundamentals of creating accessible documents. And then the second half will be around PDF remediation on how to update and manage your existing PDFs that you've got from past years. As you know, that anything that's publicly posted now requires to meet the AODA compliance legislation. So if you've got documents that are up there now, they will have to be replaced with current updated documents. I am going to also say that I'd like to put a disclaimer in here that my conversation around MS Word goes that the majority of you already know how to use Word in an intermediate to advanced level. If I touch base on things that you're not quite understanding or unfamiliar with, post a question in the chat for Deb, and then we will come back at the end of the session and review some of those details. That way, those that are comfortable with Word don't have to sit there and go through the process. So I am going to share my screen now, so we'll check back a little later. So Deb, can you just let me know if you can see my screen?
Yes, we sure can. We have steps to create an accessible Word document. That's the document you have up.
Okay. So there are some basic fundamentals to creating an accessible document. And there are about 12 to 13 checks that you can do. The one thing I will say to start, if you look down on the very bottom bar where I have my mouse here, you'll see that it says accessibility investigate. That's your key that there could be some things about this document that is not accessible to a screen reader. The whole purpose of creating accessible documents is so that someone with a screen reader will be able to also be able to hear the document as written. I like to compare this to building a house. If you build a house with accessibility in mind from the ground up to begin with, then you know that everyone can come and either live in it or visit you with making a few changes. If you build your accessible documents, whether it's in Word, Excel, or PowerPoint, with accessibility in mind from the get-go, then when you convert them to PDF, there's very few things that you will need to do to make it an accessible document. So to start with, there are certain things that are imperative to make documents accessible. One of them is text. If you use a serif font text, they have all those little tails on the text. And it makes it very difficult for someone with either visual challenges or a screen reader to identify the letters. So the preference is to use either Arial, Capri, or Verdana. It's also a necessity to keep the text fairly large so that you can use 12 point as a minimum. Font styles. We talked about that. So when you are building a document, you do not want to just take your Word and convert it to a style. So I'll just go up to home. So I don't want you, it's preferred if you don't do this and then go up and change this up here. There's style settings in Word. And what's the preference is to use these styles. And you can modify these styles. So as an example, I can modify my styles. And then if you make a change in your document, the entire document using this font style will change automatically. And you don't have to do it one by one. And when you create PDFs after a Word document, the PDFs will also be identified in their tags through the font styles. So if you have a heading at the top, which is creating accessible documents, so if I click there, you'll see it's heading 1. If I click here, you're going to see it's heading 2. And then these are lists and paragraphs. This way, when you convert them to PDFs, they will convert with these tags correctly. Another key thing that we should not be doing is using text boxes. From my work that I've done with other CAs, I have noticed that this is a thing that people love to do. Makes the documents look pretty. You can move the text box around and put it where you want, beside a picture. But they're not accessible, and screen readers cannot read what's inside a text box. Because when you insert a text box, you're basically inserting an image. And so the screen reader just says it's an image, and it doesn't tell you what it is. To get around that, it's preferred if you just type in your text, and if you do want to pop it out and highlight it, you can just put a border around it using your border formatting, which is up here. So if I wanted to highlight this, I can just put a border around it. And you'll see that that is now the appearance of a text box. But really, you've just left it as words. The downfall to that is you can't move it around like you would a text box to put it into a position of a picture. But when we talk about images, you'll understand why. List and formatting, again, it's important that you use the styles. So you'll see here, formatting with styles. If this is a numbered, then you'll just use your number styling up here as your formatting. Please avoid using just one period space when bulleted or numbered, if you choose to have this as a numbered list, because when you put it over to PDF, it will not be identified as a list. If you want to apply headings, this is again using the heading styles. They will also be able to understand if you formatted it with bold or capital letters. But again, you prefer to be able to do that in modifying your style settings and not necessarily just highlighting the word and putting bold. There's also a way in your style settings when you modify it that you can tick a box so that they're all capital letters or they're not, rather than typing them in all caps. There's no maximum or minimum requirement on how many styles that you can use. If you find the default styles are not sufficient, if you want to be able to have a level 2, which is your second down level of text, if you want one that is specifically for bold and one that's not, you can create a separate style that is for the bold text or use the regular non-bold text. And it's easily done by just creating styles. Heading order is again very crucial, because when you create headings, the tags are put into that order, and this is how a screen reader will read them, in the order of the hierarchy of the headings. If you have something that starts off as heading 2 without a heading 1 at the document, it will come up as an error. If you go with heading 1, heading 2, and then, as I have seen quite regularly in your documents, you've jumped from heading 2 to heading 5, it will come up as an irregular error in your headings. If it's, most times, if it's a heading 5, it can generally be identified as a paragraph. It really doesn't need to be a heading 5. If you have a heading 5, you need to ensure that there's also 2, 3, 4. Because if you go from 2 to 5, it'll just give you errors, which is done quite regularly in your documents. Table of contents. When you build a table of contents, always be sure that you update all the document, all the table, and not just page numbers. Because sometimes if you have changed a heading from a font style, it will not be correct in your table of contents. You will also notice that if you have a lot of table of contents that have links to certain pages, if they're not identified correctly, it'll come up as an error that it can't be tagged. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into PDF remediation, because unless you actually see it in the PDF, it's hard to explain. But I know from when I did some work for the other CAs, it took me about a week to figure out what these errors were. Because it's not something that you would expect to find if you've built your table of contents. When you build the table of contents, please use the word insert of table of contents and not build it manually. Because if you build it manually and just use ... it will not be seen as a leader. It'll be seen as tabs. It'll come up as an error. So it's really important that you use table of contents from the style or from the settings in Word. Images and objects. Here's a real big thing that I know is going to drive all of you mad. When you insert a picture, it always, always, always has to be left justified, or what they call in line with text. You can't do a text box on the left and then put a picture in on the right. It will always come up as an error saying it's out of line. The reason for that is because screen readers will read the image first. When you've added an image, you also will add alt text. This is to be able to describe what the image is. You have up to 120 characters to describe this image, but it's recommended that you're brief, because you have to remember that a screen reader is going to be reading the description of this image. When it comes to some of your documents, you will have documents, especially the water budgets, have a lot of geography maps from AutoCAD attached to these documents. Some of the documents I've done have had over 300 of these maps attached. You will then format the whole AutoCAD map as one image. You can't really describe what this map or drawing is in full detail. So I tend to just identify it by the title of what the drawing is. And then you can always speak with someone on the phone and describe what the drawing is if needed be, because you're never going to be able to describe what the actual full AutoCAD drawing is. When you want to be able to do alt text on a picture, you're going to click on the image, right click on the image and format, and add a description to the alt text. When you do that, the text box will come up and you can add whatever text you want. It's very important to also be able to wrap your text and not hit the return key. Tables. Tables is a nasty business. Tables are going to be your most trickiest, time-consuming, and absolutely hated part of doing a document for accessibility. They're very finicky and they have to be built very specifically. When you put a table in, you must always identify the header row, whether there's a header or not, because it will not get seen in a PDF as a header row and it will give you an error. When PDFs and it goes to be read, it will always look for a header row first. So whether there's one or not, always identify the top row as a header. The next thing that's also going to give you grief is it's preferred and recommended strongly that you do not merge and split cells. There are some documents that I've seen where you've merged over 2, 3, 4, 5 columns, and then you've had one cell that is merged over 3 or 4 or 5 rows. You can do this, but it will become very complicated when it comes time to remediate the PDF. I still have clients that phone me to say, can you fix this table? Because even after months of doing PDF remediation, they can't fix the table. There were some tables that took me 2.5 weeks to fix in one document because they become very intricate and very time consuming. The other thing to remember when you're creating tables is each line of a paragraph. So if you've got, say, on my screen right now, I've got 4 or 5 tabs or 4 or 5 bullet lists. Each one of those bullet lists needs to be a separate row. If you do select, insert, tab, click on table menu, hit your return key, put in another bullet, hit your return key, put in another bullet, that will all be read as one cell. If in the next column, so if you were doing finances as an example, and you had select, insert, tab, clicked on table menu, and then the next column was dollars, it would read all of these lists first and then go to that dollar, the next column. Can you just excuse me for 1 sec, please?
Yeah, of course.
Marilyn, can you come and open this window?
Thanks everyone for popping questions in the chat. We'll wait till Linda gives the thumbs up to ask questions, but Linda, we are starting to get some questions in the chat. And whenever you're ready, you'll just need to unmute, Linda.
Sorry, I needed my window open.
That's great. Thank you.
Whew. Okay, so when you're also building tables, it's important that you use your tab key and not the enter key. If you use the tab key, you will know then that it goes from row to column to column to column, then drops down to the next row, column to column to column. This way, that's the way you use a screen reader. To try and help maybe grasp this, if you were to close your eyes and someone was to read aloud your document to you, excuse me, that is how the screen reader is going to see it. So if I were to say, select, insert, tab, click on table menu, select number of rows, columns, blah, 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 and read all of this list, and then go up to something that's associated with it on the right for columns, they're not going to match. It's going to become very jumbled because people tend to do the column first, then jump up to the next column, do the next column, and the next column. Try to build them across, because that way you can be ensured when you hit the tab key, the screen reader will read it accordingly. So I think I'm going to take a bit of a break here and see what questions are in the chat.
Great, Linda. We do have some. So let me start. So when you were talking about the different styles, can you give styles any name? That might avoid the numbering issue. You're talking about the different styles.
Right. If you create a new style, you can call it whatever you want. You cannot rename the default styles that come with Word, but there's nothing to say that you cannot give the new styles what name you would like. So for instance, when I create styles, there's a default style for the bullets. The list paragraph is the style name, and you can identify it with bullets or numbers or whatever. I tend to have 2 separate list styles, one for bullets and one for numbers. So then that way you don't have to keep going in and changing them afterwards. And if you have just your bullets that you want to change, maybe the font size, only the bullets will then get changed and not both.
Thanks, Linda. And if I can just elaborate a little bit. So I use styles in my document. So we've done some AODA training. So I've created a template for my policies to update them using styles. And sometimes what you might have is, I've got my threat and my sub-threat and what type of chemical or pathogen or whatever. And sometimes when you're writing a policy, for others who may not have done this yet, maybe you don't need that heading. So, you've got heading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but one policy doesn't need the text that goes with heading 3. And if you create a document that goes heading 1, 2, 4, 5, you're going to get an error, which is very frustrating. So that's where you might want to instead change the names of your styles to, better reflect what the text is going to be in that document.
Yes, or make the minor change in the PDF. When we go into PDF remediation, it's really not very difficult to change a tag property. So if you don't have a lot of them, but if you're working from a template, I would suggest you make styles.
Yeah, and we do have, I don't know about other CAs, but we only have like one person who can do PDF remediation at our CA. So the easier I can make it for that person, the better.
Right. So if you can create a template that is accessibility to go, then you'll have less to do in the PDF side of things.
Great. Thanks, Linda. We'll take another question. Question is, Verdana and Arial are identified in the Word doc that you've shown. Item 1, bullet 2. However, I believe Linda mentioned 3 styles. What was the third one? Was it Calibri?
Oh, Calibri.
Calibri.
So if I see how I've got up here, Calibri.
Right.
That's a nice font to use, which is what this document is built on. You'll see that the letters are all nice and clean and easily identified.
Good. Another question about tables. Can you leave cells in a table empty?
Yes, what I tend to do is put a period in it. That way the period gets read as a cell in the table in the PDF, like a placeholder. But and why I do that is sometimes when you go over to the PDF and there are issues with the table, it makes it easier to find the error. If you have a bunch of blank cells, you can't always find the error, and it makes it more time consuming. So what I have suggested with some of my clients is that you put like a period as a placeholder for that empty cell.
Okay. And Linda, just so the audience knows that all of the details that you're describing and going through are going to be in that guidance document that we'll be sharing, correct?
That's correct.
Wonderful.
When we get to the guide, you'll see the guide has been built with screen captured shots. So you'll be able to see exactly what the error is, and then it gives you a step-by-step direction on how to correct the error.
Wonderful.
So you can see all of this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. A question is, does Word automatically check for accessibility compliance, or is this a function that must be switched on?
It is a function that needs to be switched on. So if you go up to File, go to Info, check for issues, and check accessibility. It will then give this label at the bottom of your page, and it will always stay on thereafter in this Word document.
That's all the questions that I have in the chat for now. Is there anything specific that the group would like to see, if that's possible, Linda? Is maybe a walkthrough? I know you've done a great job describing things, and the guidance document will also help, but was there anything that anybody needed to visually see in this session right now with the material that Linda's just covered? Okay, Linda, I don't see any arms waving and nothing in the chat. So please.
So we're going to carry on with a bit more of the word stuff.
Sounds good. I do see one in the chat, and that's I would like to see how to build a more complicated table.
Okay, I was really hoping someone wasn't going to ask me that, but the best way to create a complicated table is to use this up here. If you want to create some of the formatted tables, let me hang on. Go to tables. Let me just create. I'm going to create a new file because I don't want to screw this one up. And can you still see this file? Can you see a blank sheet?
No, we're still seeing the document that you had up.
Okay, so new share. Okay, can you see the blank sheet now?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to insert a table. And I'll just do this. Now, you see how it gives you all of these different designs? It is preferred if you use these styles, table styles, because that will remove a lot of your grief in complicated styles. So let's just say I want to take this and format it like this. Okay, let's do this. So you'll see now that it's got how you want it to look, but some of the functions that make it less complicated are already built in. And there's a whole lot of different styles that you can choose from. These table styles already have the majority of the accessibility features built into the table. So it's something that you won't have to worry about. So I'm going to go back up. Use this one. What I meant by using your tab is on your computer, and your keyboard, you have a tab key. So if you use the tab key, you'll see how it goes over column to column. This is how you should build your tables. And then it automatically drops down to the next row. Because if you were to all close your eyes, let's say I put in here 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, 8. And then I tab down to the next row. It's going to read all of these numbers instead of it'll go 1, 3, 5. So if these were your headings, it would read these headings. Then it would drop down and then go. So if this is A, B, G. But if I were to hit the return key, or use the arrow key to go down and put in arrows, go down. What's going to happen is it's going to go 1, 3, 5, 6, 7, 9, 9, 8, A, G. And if these other columns were all populated, it would then go H, G, Y, and then it would go up to this one. L M S. So it would read 1 3 5 6 7 9 9 8 A G H G Y L M S. See how that becomes out of order now if you were actually reading a row that had all of these associated with each other? Or if I were to say, hit the enter key and put in, but then I had in this column, and if that second number 7 was actually the money associated with that second D up here, it would not get read at the same time. It would read SDDER7, whatever's in 9 and 8, then go down to the next row. So if that number 7 was actually associated with this number D up here, it would not get read in the same time. So that's why if you've got columns that are associated with each column, especially if you're doing finance spreadsheets, it's important that you don't use your enter key, that you use your tab key. Does that answer that person's question?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I think just a final clarification. So the order in which you add content to the cells dictates the order in which the reader reads the table. And you're saying yes, but also using the tab key, not the enter key, correct?
That's correct.
Wonderful.
If you
And
get used to building your tables with the tab key instead of the enter key, it will always default from left to right.
Okay.
And then you don't have to worry about thinking about it.
okay. One other question, Linda, about complicated tables. When complicated tables aren't avoidable, I sometimes identify them as layout tables, which gets it through the accessibility check, but I don't know what that means for a screen reader.
And I will show you this more clearly when we come to the PDF remediation.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Linda. One other question, how should a row or column be added or deleted to maintain accessibility when you're making a table or modifying a table, I guess?
When you hover, you can see these marks for here and here. So if you use these defaults with the adding in the rows and the columns, it will maintain its accessibility.
Okay, great.
When
Okay,
I talk about merging cells, this is what you do not want to do. I know that there are going to be a lot of cases based on the expression on Deb's face that this is done. And I'm not saying don't do it, because it can be corrected in the PDF. But if you get some clients, which I have one client that's extremely adamant about accessibility in the source document and not the PDF, making sure that the source document, which is your Word document, is accessibility compliant, they will not accept merged cells. Whether you can correct them in the PDF or not, they will send it back. The ministry or the AODA legislation doesn't say you cannot use it, but just be prepared that when you use merged cells and split cells in your source document, it will need to be fixed in the PDF. There's no way around it.
Thanks for that, Linda. I do have a question about various accessibility checkers. Would you like to discuss that now? Discussing a standard that we are expected to achieve compliance. And that's kind of talking about the Word versus the Adobe checker. Do you want to talk about that now, or would you like to wait until you go through the remediation portion?
I prefer to use that, to go through that when we do the remediation.
Okay.
But keep in mind that if I were to click on this accessibility at the bottom, it will bring up this screen. So right now, because this is a blank document that I've used using the word defaults, there are no issues. But if I go back to this one, can you see my original document still?
No, not yet.
So I have to go back to share it again. So you'll see it says accessibility investigate. You'll see that I'm missing an alt text. And this is because the other day I added in this logo, Deb, but I haven't applied alt text to it yet. So since we're here doing it, instead of waiting to go further in, the easiest way to do that is to click this arrow. Now you can either add a description, or if this logo isn't important that a screen reader identifies what it is, you can make it marked as decorative. If you want the people to recognize that Ontario has been added to this as a support, we can put that in this here. So I can say that this is MECP logo provided support to the creation of this guide book. Okay, so then when the screen reader comes to this image, it will read this MC logo provide support to the creation of this guidebook.
Okay. I think the question will be, there's a lot of different checkers out there, and which one do you recommend? Perhaps that's the question that we're looking an answer for, and we can discuss that, as you said, when you're doing the remediation portion of the presentation. So we'll put a pin in it. And I don't see anything further, Linda, so if you'd like to continue on.
Okay. Another thing that a lot of your documents have is hyperlinks. A lot of you have hyperlinks relating to certain areas of a document. So you'll talk about a certain image that's in, oh, I don't know, referencing a certain figure. A lot of the documents that I've created for other CAs have a lot of figures in them, and your paragraph writing always refers to certain figures. So you'll have in there, let's just say I put in here that assistive technologies is a hyperlink to somewhere else in the document. And a lot of you do with like bookmarks and hyperlinks and that kind of thing throughout your document. It's very important that you use the correct wording when you speak about a hyperlink. It becomes very confusing if you say click here and then it takes you to somewhere else in the document. The person who's using a screen reader has no idea what click here means. So for that, for using assistive technologies, I would say the person who uses assistive technologies, I would make that the hyperlink. I wouldn't say person who uses assistive technologies, click here, and then use click here as the hyperlink, because it doesn't know what click here is talking about. There's nothing wrong with using even a whole sentence as your hyperlink if that will identify what you're talking about. There's nothing in the book that says that you can only use 1 or 2 words. So if making an entire sentence makes sense to the person to describe what the hyperlink is, go ahead and do that. So in some of your documents, you say figure 1 is, I don't know, drilling wells of municipality, blah, blah, blah. You can have that whole drilling wells of municipality as your hyperlink, or figure 1.1 and give the description of what figure 1.1 is, you can have that as your whole hyperlink. There's nothing to say that you have to just have 1 or 2 words. The clearer you can be on a hyperlink, the simpler it will be for someone who's trying to understand what you're talking about. You can use columns if you want to be able to format a document using columns, but again, use the tools that are built in Word. Don't just try and use tabs, because the tabs will become very confusing after you remediate it, because they don't always align, they will jumble. Page numbering, that's usually in your footer or your header. Now, when I talk about footers and headers, keep in mind that the information within these headers and footers will not be read in a screen reader. They get documented as archived in your PDF. So if you have important information in your header that you need your person, the reader, to read what's in there, it needs to be in the body of your document. When you put page numbers in, although that the screen reader will not read what's in the footer, it will identify the page, because it's you've gone down the next page. So if you're on page 3, it will say page 3. Even though it doesn't read what's in the footer, the software is smart enough to know what page you're on. But if you have your business title in the footer, so if you have the Conservation Ontario as what's in your footer, it will not read that. So if you also in your footer say Conservation Ontario, and then you make that a hyperlink to your website, Deb, it will not go to that link, which is a common occurrence for your third-party vendors. A lot of your third parties tend to use their company logos at the bottom of their pages, and then they will hyperlink it so that you can go to their website. It will not be read. It'll come up as an error. Always keep in mind that colors are a very finicky situation. A lot of the tables that I've seen in your source water budget documents are color coded. So they will put a row in color red and then reference that to something otherwise in another page. A lot of it will reference a certain figure. The colors that you put in this table will not be read as a color. So if you have rows of red, rows of yellow, rows of blues that represent something specific throughout your document, they will not be read. And there are a lot of your documents that are identified this way. A lot. So you have to come up with, what I've done for another client is I put a note at the bottom of the table that says red and what it represented in the document, yellow what it represented. That way, at least that gives you some sense of understanding of what the colors mean, if it's important that you have it. It's preferable if you use black on white. If you need to have a dark background so that you've, say in a table, you've got a beautiful blue as your header color for that title, for that row, you make it a nice blue, which most people tend to do. And you then put white text on top of that blue. The white text will have to be bold. And that comes again with changing your styles, because a regular white text on blue can be tricky to read. So just keep in mind that someone who has low vision still has to be able to read the text on top of that color. Yellow is really a color that is strongly suggested that you do not use, because yellow is very difficult for those that have color blindness, or there's that, sorry, I just lost the word. Some of them cannot identify different colors. And then lastly, we talk about checker. So when we talked about what checkers to use, if it's Microsoft Word or Excel or PowerPoint, they all have their own built-in checkers. So it's preferred to use those checkers and not try and do it manually, unless, you know, if you build a template and you've built that template using the accessibility checker and the template is used correctly, you shouldn't have issues. But that will totally depend on how your users use your template. And then it comes to PDF remediation. Adobe Pro DC, or yeah, Adobe Pro DC. That's the Adobe checker and remediator that I use. There's another one that's called PAC, P-A-C. I find that one a lot more less user-friendly. It's a little more difficult to get used to using. So if your PDF remediator in your office is an experienced user for PAC, there's no reason you cannot continue to use that software. It's just, I will not be able to provide you support because I don't use PAC and I prefer not to use PAC, but that's my preference only. The PDF remediation guidebook that I have written has all been done through Adobe Acrobat Pro DC. They are very similar. I just find Adobe far more user-friendly. And when it comes to the help in Adobe, I find it more informative than the PAC software. So before we go back in, we start the next session into PDFs. Do we have any more questions on this section?
We do. Okay, you did mention an alternative to using color. Thank you for that. When it comes to font size, I know that 12 is recommended. I've had someone indicate that as long as the document can be zoomed in up to 200%, then small font is fine, since the screen reader will read it regardless, and it is okay for sighted and non-sighted.
Yes, if you have your browser or your computer set up to be able to magnify your screen, because I know there are a lot of your tables that use 10 point because there's so much information in them. You can use them. It's just that if you can default to 12 point, that's recommended. But if you have to use a 10 point, we would prefer you don't go lower than 10. But if you need to use a 10 point because you've got so much information in your table, or sometimes if, say, you've done an introductory page and you're going to give that to someone else who's already built a document and you don't want to change the page numbers because that makes a mess of their document, you can go down a text font in order to ensure that the page numbering stays the same, and your magnifier will come into play.
Thanks, Linda. Are there any rules related to line spacing?
Yes, thank you for mentioning that. So it's preference to always have in your paragraph lining, I tend to use 1.15. And then, so if I go over to, let's say, home, and I go to paragraph and line spacing options, I tend to use the before and after in the spacing, because what you don't want to do is hit your return key to give you that extra space, because that's going to come up as a tag in your PDF and it's redundant. So rather than doing that, if I wanted to add more space, I would do it like this. And it'll adjust the page spacing itself. That way you can still keep the white space and the screen reader will, or the PDF will not create it as an error.
Thanks. Linda, is this the line spacing that you're recommending 1.5? This is just a best practice or this is a must?
It's a best practice.
A best practice. Okay.
If you want to increase it to 1.5 or any of the other options that are available to you, you can do that.
Okay.
It's just not recommended to stay at 1.
Okay. Okay. Another question is, if you are working on a track changes document, how does it work with these formatting changes? Like, are you, I guess maybe the question is, are you checking accessibility after all of the changes have been accepted and then your document is final, or are you able to incorporate the accessibility changes as you're working on the document? Keith, I hope I've explained that question correctly.
I think I understand. If you are using track changes on a document, they will not be seen as errors. The accessibility checker will not read that you've underlined it or crossed it out or added a comment or inserted a comment. They will not be seen as part of the accessibility checker, only until you've confirmed and accepted all those changes. So you can go ahead and put track changes in and edit the document as much as you want, but the checker will not understand that as accessibility bad or good until you've confirmed those changes. Does that answer the question?
So the reason for the question is that the submission packages that we have to send in require a clean and a track changes version, and the track changes version is kind of the working document.
Correct.
So I'm thinking, you know, at the end, maybe the final check would just be on the clean version. If it's like, I don't want to mess up the track changes version by doing a lot of things. I'm just wondering, you know, if that's acceptable.
The ministry does not require your track changes one to be accessible compliant.
Okay, that's
but
good.
Your clean version does.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. That same question just popped up in the chat. So thanks for clarifying that about the track changes being compliant or not. Okay, in light of time, do we have any other further questions? Or Linda, are you ready to move on to the next section? Yes. And I don't see any hands or any further questions. One further question, sorry, does the accessibility checker in Word provide a function which reads the material back to the author so they can hear what it sounds like? Is that an external software that needs to be used?
There's a speaking add-on in Word, but it depends on what version of Word you're using.
Okay.
So you can go in and find the add-on in Word, and it will read it back to you. But that will depend on what version of Word that you use. I use Word 365, so I do have it in mind. I'm not sure of any earlier versions if they do or not.
Okay, thanks, Linda. That was a good question. Okay, Linda, please take it away for the next section.
Okay, so now we're going to go on to remediating PDFs. So just give me 1 second because I want to load a PDF. Okay. So when I built this document, what I've done is I've done screen captures of each of the errors and shown you where you will find them. So when I loaded up, say, chapter 3, and I ran the accessibility checker, which I'm going to do in a minute, it showed me these errors. And then over here, it will show you where to fix them. So we're going to go through these relatively quickly, but as I've mentioned, that you will see all of that we talk about in this book. So if there's something that doesn't quite you don't quite grasp, we can go back and cover it. But you will find it in this guidebook. If there's something that we talk about today that I have not got in the guidebook, I will add it to it before I send it over to Deb. Because I've been doing this for so many years that sometimes I just may overlook it because it's a given for me to do, and I don't really think about it. Or the documents that Deb provided me didn't necessarily have a certain error in it, so I couldn't screen capture it to correct it. But it's easy enough to do and add, or if there's some things in here that you need clarity, I'm happy to add that as well. And Deb, I haven't said this to you earlier, but after people have received the guidebook, if there are questions or things about the book that they would like clarity on, I'm happy to give that.
Oh, many thanks.
So you're welcome to give them my email address and I will be available to help them through the guidebook.
Thank you, Linda.
Okay. So I'm going to go in now and show you a typical PDF so we can do a couple of the steps. So you should be seeing chapter 5 on your screen now. Yes, Deb, thumbs up.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So this is a typical document that assessment reports are a pretty basic document that a lot of UCAs do. So I've chosen to use a full AR report that Deb provided me as samples for this so that the actual content of it makes sense to you when I referenced it in the PDF guidebook. So if I can move this. Okay, so if I've opened this document and what I'm going to do is go down to the accessibility checker. And I'm going to run check. And this will come up. These are all the defaults that are normally done. You may as well leave them all on because then you don't have to try and think about what needs to be checked. This is a standard default and it's just best to leave them all on. And I'm going to start checking. So now what it's doing is it's going through the whole document and taking a look at what needs to be corrected to make this an accessible document. So now you will see over on the left a navigator that shows you what's wrong with these documents. So it says here that there are no tags. So if I go over to the tag icon, there's tags here, but some things in this document are not tagged. Rather than trying to go through the document and figure out what they are, you can go over here and you can either auto tag the document or you can just right click and say fix. It will then go through the pages again and it will add in the tags that it couldn't find. And now you'll see that the bold has gone, it says passed. Any document that is larger than 20 pages requires bookmarks. These bookmarks, and this is where the heading styles are very important. The bookmarks are created using heading styles. So the better that you, the clearer that you put your source document with styles, the easier it will be to make your bookmarks. So if we were to right click on bookmarks and say fix, it's going to ask me now how I want it to be bookmarked. And I would say, and you can shift pick. So if there was H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, you could shift pick and create all those bookmarks and say, okay. Again, it's going to go through the document, find all the pieces of this document that are identified as heading 1 and heading 2, and use those to make your bookmark. If you do this in your Word source document first, it will not come up as an error in this document. My guess is that this document was created in June 2011, which likely didn't have the ability in the Word software to create bookmarks. So that's why it's come up as an error in the PDF. The older documents that you have likely will not have bookmarks. So if we go over to the icon that's bookmarks now, you will see they now have all your bookmarks identified from what you've used as heading 1 and heading 2. Now, this is actually a very good example because you see all of these 5.1, 1.1.1. You've identified that in your source document as a heading 2 style. And I don't really think that this is a heading 2 style, because it's down 2 or 3. So I would say this is heading 1, this is heading 2, and this is heading 3. But in your source document, you've identified it as heading 2, so that's why it's now added in the bookmark under heading 2. So this is where it gets a little helter-skelter if your source document hasn't been built correctly. So now you'll see there are only 2 issues. These 2 issues for logical reading order, manual check, and color contrast, manual check. You can check them if you want, but these 2 errors will come up every time you open this PDF. They will never go away. So if you find it that you're comfortable with your color contrast so that you haven't used any yellow or green or red, and you've corrected it, you can just ignore this color contrast needs manual check. Because it's a manual check, it will always come up. And those that are doing your PDF remediating will know that they can just accept these 2 errors, as will the ministry. So then we come into tables, and what I was talking about is headers. So you will see all these tables have not been identified with headers. So here's heading 1 or table 1. It was created, but you probably didn't have the tick box for headers ticked off in your Word source document. So the PDF is not understanding that there's a header on here. In the guidebook, we'll go back and share the guidebook again. You will see that I've got all of these identified. So you'll see what we showed you today is a right click, and it says in here, I've said right click on tagged PDF, click fix, and it will pass. So that's what we just did in the book, on the PDF. I'm going to go to page content errors in a minute because this is the one that I talked to you about that becomes very confusing. So just give me a minute and I'll go back with that. I'm just going to go down to the table error because that's the document that I have open. Oh, you'll see I also have talked about bookmarks. Bookmarks failed, how to correct it. So you'll be able to see what the error looks like in your document and then how to correct it. And then I say, go to the Books Navigator, which is this little icon that we used over here, which I have highlighted here. And I say to click on the square icon, which is this little square up here. It will come down and tell you how to new bookmarks from structure. Bring up the screen. And then if you want to title this, you can call it whatever you'd like. So I'm going to go down to tables because that's where I have. Okay. So now we're going to talk about tables and headers. So this is where you will see that these tables, this is one of those complicated ones. So let me see if I can see what that might be 6. So if you look at this table, you will see what I was talking about with a very complicated table. How you have columns 2 and 3 identified with headers, but you don't have anything over column 1. So it's come up saying it can't find this content because it's looking for that cell information. And there's nothing there in this table because you didn't identify it in the table. And this is where I was saying it can get very complicated in fixing it. I'm not going to really talk about that today because there's no way in the world I can explain this to you in one quick step. If the people that you have doing remediating in your office want some help with that, I'm happy to do that for them. So if I'm going to go back to sharing the.
And we have a question too, Linda, whenever you're ready.
Go ahead.
All right. The question is there any way to save a PDF with tags? Maybe Katie, I don't know if you want to elaborate more on that question.
Yeah, so when you save a PDF from Word, so we had Access Word for a little bit, and when you saved it as a PDF using Access Word, it did all of the tagging for you, or Access PDF.
Okay,
thank
you for
I don't have access to that program anymore.
Yeah, okay, and I'm glad you brought that up because that actually is a very good point that I would like to cover. So I'm going to go back to the Word document. When you're finished with your source document and you want to create a PDF, you're going to go up to File. Do not use this Save as PDF because it will not create the tags correctly. And it's a glitch in the software that they're working on, but up to the current version of Word, it's not corrected. And it took a lot of us in the field to discover the problem as to why our tags were not being created correctly. And it turned out there's a glitch here. So what you want to do is to just do a regular save as, use your drop down and create the PDF. That way, Katie, your tags will be created correctly. So does that answer your question, Katie?
I see a thumbs up.
Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to the PDF. So I've outlined this in detail on how to correct this in your guidebook, but just to give you an idea on how it can be done, there's two ways to do it. You can either right click on element 1 and say show in tags, and it's going to now take me in the tags list as to where this table is. So if I expand this, you're going to just see that there are table data cells, and that this cell is not really identified as a header. It's only being referred to as a data cell. And that's because it wasn't identified correctly in the Word doc. So you can do this in one or two ways. You can either right click and go to properties and change this to a header cell. Or you can go over to the reading order. Now, your experienced PDF people will probably be using this reading order on quite a regular basis. And it just makes things a lot easier to work with, especially when you're working with tables. So you're going to click on reading order, and it's going to bring over a new screen. So wait a minute. Oh, there we are. Okay. So what I want to do is I'm going to click on the table. So I'm going to move my cursor until I can see a hand. And this allows me to click on the table. And what I will then do is go to table editor. And you will see that it's all the same color now. That will tell you that it's not formatted correctly. So I can then click on this cell, right click. Now, I know I'm going a little fast, but remember, this is all outlined in the book. And I click table cells, and oh, I already did that one through the properties. So let's click another one. So I'll click this one, right click, table cells. I can change it to a header cell and click OK. Now, if I were to go back over to my checker, and I'm just going to see there were 13. So if I go and I check again, this list now is going to drop down to 12 because I have fixed table 1. So you'll see we now have 12. And if I go to click on the next element, it'll come to the next table. And again, it's basically the same thing. So I'm just going to go back now to my Word doc, my guidebook. I do know I'm going fairly quickly, but there's a lot to cover, so. But again, you will see that I've talked about how to actually find these ways to do it. So you can right click on tag, talk about the menu, and repeat for the other elements. And then I've talked about how you can do it using the read order. So what I basically showed you very quickly, I've outlined here with pictures. So you can go through and fix them. And you'll see I've got circles around whatever item I'm talking about in this list. And these lists are step by step on how to fix it. So if you use this book, you will actually be able to just do exactly what these lists tell you, and it will fix the error. So that was tables. Alt text, this is what I was talking to you about alt text, and I'm just going to pull up another document so I can see on alt text. So I've just pulled up chapter 6, and again, I'm going to run the checker. Accessibility check. Checking. Just going through reading the 74 pages and to look and see what's wrong with it. I know some of you are probably a little overwhelmed with this right now because it really is a lot to take in. And I've been doing it for a few years, so to me, it just seems to be like a given, but I definitely appreciate where your mind might be at, and that didn't give me a, let me see if I can find. Bear with me a second. I'm trying to see if I can find something that's got documents or pictures. Nope. Oh, here's chapter 2 that's got 287 pages. And you're going to have a lot of these documents. I had some from another client, Simcoe, that had 700 pages. It took me a whole week to PDF remediate it. And actually, this is going to be a good one to do the checker on. Oh, hang on. I'm going to share this.
We do have another question, Linda, when you're ready.
Okay, go ahead.
Do we resave a PDF that has been checked over as a basic PDF or use one of the other formats, PDF/A, PDF/E, PDF/X?
That will depend on how comfortable the person that's remediating the document. Because a lot of the changes that you do in a PDF cannot be undone. It's not like Word where you can go undo, undo, undo for a number of times to go back to where you started from. You don't have that luxury in PDF. Once the change is done in a PDF, it's done. So if you're not very comfortable with how you're remediating that PDF, my suggestion would be to save it as something else. And then once you get going on it, you don't necessarily have to do that. But just bear in mind that once you've made a change in a PDF, you can't go back.
David, did that answer your question?
Partly. I guess I've seen, yeah, like you save it and then yeah, it's hard to go and fix things again, and you might have to start from scratch, which is frustrating. But can it also, I don't know, sometimes I'm looking, it seems like it just made more errors than.
Well, and I did experience that a few times in some of the documents. So like, for instance, when I created, when I had to work on those 700 pages, I broke those pages down into smaller portions so that if I did make a mistake, it wasn't so overwhelming or tedious to start over again in the smaller portions, and then just put them all back together again after I finished doing the smaller pieces, segments. Once you get used to being a remediator, you won't find that you're going to need to keep copies very often, depending on how old or how new your document is. But it couldn't be frustrating to, like, until I got used to doing some of the very complicated tables for Simcoe, I was saving them as a different file name just because you can screw it up very easily in tables, and when you do that, you can't go back.
Thanks, Linda. Do have another question. Can you convert a PDF to Word, make edits, use the accessibility checker, and then convert it back to PDF?
Yes, for some of the complicated files that I did for Simcoe, I did that. I took the PDF because some of them were really old PDFs. I did find it easier to take that PDF, export it out to Word, make the corrections in the Word doc using the guider for the accessibility checker in the Word document, and then I saved it back as a PDF. So you can do that, and depending on the complexity of the file, sometimes it's good to do that. So here we have the alternate text, and it's talking about these figures. So here's a typical figure that you don't have a label for. And so what you're going to do is you're going to right click on the image. Actually, you're going to take the, sorry, you're going to right click on the figure and say fix. And it'll come up with a different pop-up. So now you can just explain to what this is. And for me, I identified this as what the picture was. So somewhere in this document, it might have had a figure number, but it's actually the components of a water budget. So I said that this was a schematic or a diagram showing the components of a water budget. It doesn't make sense to go through into great detail explaining this, because if you can't visually see it, unless you're really good with the English language explaining it in 120 characters, it can get very confusing. And keep in mind that your paragraphs below the image will probably talk about the image as well. So you can keep that in mind when you're correcting it. And once I've added this, I'm just going to do this. I can go to the next arrow and it will bring me to this next image. So here's actually a typical faux pas where this document is in the wrong place. But for some reason, this text was added in correctly using the wrap text feature, so it didn't come up as an error. I'm just going to cancel this. We could go through all of these images. And once it's done, here I would say that this is a pie chart and explain to them that this is figure 3-2. It's a pie chart showing the water withdrawal source, and give the percentages in the description. That way, even though they can't see the pie chart, they know what the representation of this pie chart is. And then you can actually save and close, but in this case, I'm going to cancel. In this document, you also have tag content failed, which we had before. So you can't actually fix this with the right click, because this is where I was talking about images that are not done correctly. So here's a typical letter that a lot of you add into your documents, and it's been a scanned image. And what's happened is, because it's a scanned image, the PDF remediator software doesn't know what this is. And this is one that took me a long time to try and figure out how to fix it. And I'm not going to go through this today because it is extremely complicated, very confusing. But if your remediators need help with it, I'm happy to work with them to do that. But for today, it will just be mind-boggling on the steps that needs to be taken to fix this. Tab order, you could just easily right-click and say fix. And this will go through, and what it is it's just some of your pages may have been out of order and moved around, but it will fix it for you. So again, it's going through. Keep in mind that the more pages you have, the longer this process will take when it comes to evaluating for certain steps. It doesn't do that for all of them. Usually it's just under the page content tabs.
Linda, we do have a question, and I am aware of the time. I think we had booked till 11:30, but if you don't mind continuing, and if other people are able to stay on the call, I encourage people to stay. The question that we have is there a suggested order of operations for repairing errors, such as tags, then reading order, then alt text? For example, I believe on one occasion I lost the alt text I had fixed when I later corrected the reading order. It's a little bit more process related for as you're fixing all of the errors for the in the accessibility checker.
There's not really a standard order. I personally, because I've been doing it for so long, tend to go through and do the easy ones and then save the documents, so that when I get into things more complicated, like this tagged content failed or the tables, I do them last because they're more time consuming. But actual order, there really isn't a lot of best practice for orders. The way I've written the book is by the listing on this side of your navigator page. That's how I've done the book, is in this order. But when it comes to actually correcting them, there's no specific order.
That's great, thank you.
Here again, we're going to have here you see here, you've got a consultant study partners, and it has no heading. So it's been put into a table, but there's no heading. So as a quick turnaround, because I didn't have actually any source document to correct in this one, I just identified this this statement: the findings in this report were developed in part following consult. I made this your heading row and included it in the table. So how I did that is I'll go to the tags panel. And you'll see that this is the first row, but this really isn't a heading. It's the name of some of your partners. But up here is the paragraph that actually says what it is. So what I did was I created a new table row, and I just moved this paragraph into a table row down here, so it became a header. You can't actually add words to this, so I couldn't have inserted a row and put in a title for this table, because you can't do that in a PDF and have it without a tag. So I created the tag manually. And again, your remediators should be able to do this, but you just kind of have to guess about what some of this stuff is when you have, and this is why when you're in Word, it's important and it's useful to keep in mind what it's going to look like when you convert it to PDF. Because the more of these things, so if you were building this table in Word, you could in fact create another row and say names of consultants and partners and make that your header row. And I mean, I could take this page, extract it out to Word, add that in there. If I was remediating this document for a client, I would export this page out to Word, add in a new heading row, and then save it back and put it back into this document. But again, that depends on how finicky your clients are, or how well you want to be able to, how correctly correct you fix this. So I'm just going to go back to my Word doc now.
Linda, just have a question.
Yeah.
Can you show us how you make the title the header row?
Sorry, say that again.
Maybe Ilona, are you looking for this particular table that's in the PDF? Would you like Linda to show you how you could make the title the header row? So here, make consultants and study partners a header. So where you have it.
Oh, okay. So you're seeing this page again?
Yes.
Consultants? Okay, so she'd like to see how I created this as a header row in this table.
Yes, please.
Okay, so what I do is I'm going to actually create a new tag. And it's going to be a new table row because you have to do this in order. So I'm going to create a new table row. And I'll just move that up into its proper place. Then with this table row, I need to actually create a cell that tells it whether it's a data cell or a header cell. So again, I'm going to create a new tag. And I'm going to create it as a header cell. So then you just click and drag it so it's underneath so that the hierarchy starts. So now you're going to see that I have a header cell, but it's empty. And I'm going to take this paragraph that I'm going to use as part of the default for this heading, and I'm going to click and drag it down into this header. So now you'll see when I click on the word table, this first statement is now part of this table. So this table row is now identified as the header, and it's part of the table now. So if I were to go back at the checker and recheck, it would now see that this table has been corrected and has a header row. And as you see, it's now incorporated, not as a standalone piece of paragraph, but it's actually part of the table now. So when you have some of these tables that don't have it, I mean, the easiest way to do it is to take a part of the paragraph, and sometimes this may have been two lines. I mean, the findings in this report was 1 line, consultants and partners was 2nd line, or however it was written. You don't necessarily have to take it, but you would just take this whole character. So you'll now see that this is part of this table header. Does that make sense?
And Linda, is this in the guidance document as well?
I don't think so. So this is something that I could probably add in. And that's why I say that's definitely not in here, but I will add it.
I think that would be great.
That's why I didn't print the guidebook, distribute the guidebook first.
Perfect.
I would have just done that as a given, but this is something that definitely I can put into the book.
Great, thank you.
And then as the final step, what is good practice is to go through the tags. So so you can always go up to this box here and say check again, and it will always check it. But sometimes it doesn't necessarily identify the order of your tags on how it's read. So what I like to do is I like to go through the tags and just be sure that the tags are in the correct order, because the order of the tags is how the document is read. So by that, I mean, I'm going to go over to this tags picture. And I'm going to start off, this is the first, so you'll see this is actually a very good example of, you've got this as normal text in your Word doc instead of heading 1. And you've got purpose as heading 1, which actually this isn't a heading at all. It's part of your paragraph. You could make it a heading 2 if you like, but it's really not heading 1. So in this case, I would have gone into properties. made this a heading 1, and I would make this, which is purpose, a heading 2. And this is what I say by making things, because if you look at this one, this is heading 1, which really, again, isn't heading 1, it's heading 2. Because chapter 5 is your first heading. Now, keep in mind that PDFs do not have something that's called title. So if you're in your Word source document, you've identified this as title, sometimes it'll come up as heading 1, sometimes it doesn't. And this is just one of those finicky things with the software, depending on what version of Word you convert it through. So this is why I like to do a tag check before I finish off the document. So I would make this a heading 2. And then we're going to get into this thing that I was talking about. This would be a heading 3. This actually becomes very tedious, but it's important so that your screen reader reads it correctly. And then I would just use my down arrow key on the keyboard and go through the tags. And just make sure that the tags are all in the correct order. Now you'll see some of these blank tags. This is because some people tend to use the return key to drop down to the next page. Please do not do that. You need to insert page breaks, because now you've got these empty tags that mean nothing. So I would actually delete these tags. Oops. I would actually delete tag. And then the next one. So these are empty tags that mean nothing, but you've used them because you've hit the enter key going in to get to the next page instead of using insert page break. In between paragraphs, if you were to use your paragraph spacing instead of hitting the enter key, this tag would not be here. This is where your paragraph spacing comes into play in your source document. Here's why you use the list paragraphs in your Word document, because they will be identified as a list. Now here you've got this identified as a heading 2. It's not really a heading 2, it's part of the paragraph. It's just bolded as part of your paragraph. You wouldn't necessarily need to be this identified as a heading. So again, I would change this to a paragraph. Now, this also can depend on the format of how your organization does things and how you build your template, if you prefer. But if you are having a client that is your ministry, they will call you on this. And I've been called on this, so that I'm telling you this from experience. That I used to leave them as heading 2s before, but I was called on it because if you go to the YCAG guidelines, which is a whole other cup of tea, it clearly states that this is not a heading, this is just part of your paragraph. So you may as well fix it now rather than having the ministry send it back. And you just go through, and you can see why this can become a little tedious when you have large documents, which is why I also took the larger documents and snipped them down into smaller documents, just so that it was easier to go through the tags as the final check. And I think that will be the end of it today, because I'm probably totally have overwhelmed you. But everything is in here that we've talked about today. And here I've said, don't take for granted that the tags are in the order of the reading. Ensure that the first tag is identified as document, and then go check for empty tags.
Linda, this has been so helpful and valuable. I have to admit, I'm left feeling a little bit guilty every time you said you are hitting the enter instead of insert page break. Guilty. Instead of using tab, I use enter. Guilty. So I am confessing my document building sins now, and have learned so much just in this short training session. And I'm very grateful that you've put this all in a guidance document that people can refer to as a resource. Thank you again for also offering your one-on-one support after the training session. I do hope that people on the call take advantage of that, because Linda is so knowledgeable, as you've heard during this session, and is willing to help. So I'm very grateful again, Linda, and hope people take advantage of that. I don't see any other questions, Linda. I know we did run a little bit over time, but I think this was a wonderful, valuable training session. And I also see other people admitting their guilt of document building improperly as well. So on behalf of everyone on the call and the others that are probably going to watch this that weren't able to make the call, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
All right, everyone, have a great day. Thank you for your time coming this morning and listening and learning. And we'll talk to you again soon.